They refused him water before sundown, so he rode into the dark carrying food for the only people who never asked his name. The dust still clung to Ethan Cole's coat when the last light slipped behind the mesas, turning the land into shadows and ember glow, and somewhere behind him, a town had already decided what kind of man he was, but out here, where the wind spoke louder than men, decisions didn't hold their weight for long, only actions did, and Ethan had made his. The canvas sack tied behind his saddle creaked softly with every step of his horse, the smell of fresh meat rising faintly into the cooling air, not enough to announce itself, just enough to exist, like him, quiet, deliberate, unnoticed unless you were looking for it, and ahead, beyond a line of darkened cottonwoods, faint trails of smoke curled upward, thin and patient, marking the presence of the Apache camp like a heartbeat under the earth, steady and alive, and Ethan slowed his horse before the ridge, not out of fear, but out of respect, the kind his mother had taught him without ever using the word, the kind you showed by not rushing into a place that wasn't yours. He dismounted without sound, boots pressing into the dry soil, reins loose in his hand, no rifle slung over his shoulder, no hand resting near a gun, just a man standing where he knew he didn't belong, carrying something he had no right to offer and yet no reason to keep, and for a moment, he just stood there, listening, the low murmur of voices carried on the wind, the crackle of firewood, the distant laugh of a child who hadn't learned yet how heavy the world could be, and Ethan exhaled slowly, stepping forward into the edge of their world, placing the sack gently on the ground where the firelight could find it, where it wouldn't be mistaken for something hidden or something meant to surprise, and then he stepped back, just one pace, enough to say this is yours now, not mine, enough to say I'm not here to take anything with me. The first figure appeared like it had always been there, a silhouette unfolding from shadow, then another, and another, until the quiet between heartbeats filled with presence, and Ethan didn't move, didn't reach, didn't speak, because out here, words came last, and the tallest among them stepped forward, stopping just far enough to measure the distance between stranger and intention, eyes steady, unreadable, and Ethan met that gaze without challenge, without lowering his own, just holding it the way a man holds the horizon, knowing it's not his to claim, only to face, and somewhere to his left, he heard softer steps, lighter, quicker, and when he glanced, just slightly, he saw her. Ayanna, watching not the meat, not the warriors, but him, as if the question wasn't what he brought, but why he brought it at all, and in that stillness, under a sky turning deeper with every passing second, Ethan Cole stood without a weapon, without a word, offering something small in a place where small things were never simple, and the night, for a long breath, chose not to answer. The night passed in quiet reverence, the camp unchanged by the man who had left nothing behind but the scent of fresh meat and the weight of a choice. Ethan slept in the cold, his back to the earth, listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional shift of hooves on the ground. He thought about the town he had left behind, the whispers that followed him through every door, the people who spoke as though they knew him without ever asking. He wasn't part of the land anymore, not the way he used to be. Out here, where the stars hung close enough to touch, he could breathe easier, as though the distance between himself and his past had stretched far enough to become a different life. When dawn came, he stood, stretching his legs, the morning air biting against his skin, and his first step toward the camp was met by a soft but steady rhythm of footsteps behind him. Ayanna, her feet barely disturbing the earth beneath her, moved like smoke between the shadows. She was watching him, but there was something different now, a shift he couldn't explain, something like curiosity but stronger, more patient, like the earth waiting for the first rain of the season. She stopped a few feet away, and the firelight flickered in her eyes, reflecting something he couldn't quite name. "You don't speak much," she said, her voice low but clear, the words carried by the wind. Ethan turned toward her, his heart quiet in his chest, and nodded. Nothing to say. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding, a bond forged not in words but in presence. She looked at him for a long while, her gaze steady, as if testing something inside of him, something she had already decided. "You brought food," she said, almost to herself, her tone unreadable. "It is not the food that matters," Ethan replied, his voice rough from sleep and the desert air. "It is the gesture. You didn't have to, but you did. He looked at the camp behind her, the faces of the Apache people just beginning to stir in the early light, and felt the weight of their eyes, the questions they might be asking, even if they were too proud to speak them aloud. Ayana's eyes softened, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since he had arrived. She had seen what he had done, not just with his hands but with his heart. And in that quiet, there was no need for explanations, no need for defenses. The world could change in a single gesture, a single moment where kindness reached out and found its place, even in the hardest of hearts. She stepped closer, the dust rising around her like a soft cloud, and placed her hand on the bundle of meat, the weight of it shifting as though it, too, belonged to them now. Ethan felt the shift, felt something settle inside him, like a door opening, a bridge crossing a gap that had always been too wide to cross. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was something else, something he couldn't name, not yet. Ayana looked up at him, her face unreadable again, but there was something different in her gaze. "You are not like them," she said simply, the words a quiet declaration, as though it was not a question, but a statement of fact. Ethan didn't know how to reply to that. He hadn't come here to prove anything to anyone, least of all to her. But there it was, the weight of her words sitting heavy between them, a challenge in disguise, a test of the truth he hadn't even realized he had been trying to hide from himself. And for the first time since he had set foot on Apache land, Ethan Cole felt something stir deep inside him, something old and forgotten. Something that had once been his own. In the distance, a horse whinnied, the sun still a shadow on the horizon. And in the space between them, Ayana's eyes never left his, her presence as steady as the ground beneath their feet, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan understood the silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything that could be said, and everything that didn't need to be. The world hadn't changed yet, but it was changing. And for now, that was enough. The days passed slowly, the sun dipping lower with each one, and in the quiet of the camp, Ethan began to find a rhythm. The mornings came with the call of birds, the soft crunch of footsteps over the dry earth, and the distant murmur of the Apache voices that surrounded him. He had not spoken much since the day he arrived, but he no longer felt the weight of their eyes. It wasn't acceptance, not in the way he thought it might be. It was more like the land itself had begun to soften around him, and in turn, so had he. Ayana's presence had become a constant. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was with the authority of someone who had seen the world as it was, not as it was hoped to be. She moved through the camp like the wind, unseen yet felt, her steps purposeful, her gaze steady. Ethan began to understand that silence had a language of its own here, one that did not require words but understanding. He had not come looking for forgiveness, but something else. Maybe it was the hope that he could change, that this land could change him. A week passed, and the fire at night no longer seemed so foreign. He sat with the others, his legs crossed, his face softened by the glow, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like an outsider. The food he had brought was shared, passed between hands without hesitation, without question. The hunters were preparing for the next hunt, and even though Ethan had no skill with a bow or a rifle, they had shown him the way. The land spoke to him in ways that words could not. He had always been a man of the earth, of sweat and hard work. But this place was different. There was a stillness here, a quiet that felt deeper than anything he had known. Ayana approached him one evening, as the sun began to sink behind the hills. She did not speak, but there was a question in her eyes, one he had been waiting for. "You are learning," she said, her voice soft but clear. Ethan nodded, unsure of the words to say. "I am," he replied finally, his voice rough from the days of silence, of thought. She studied him for a moment, then turned to walk away. He watched her, wondering what lay behind her steady gaze, what past she carried that had shaped the woman who stood before him. The next morning, Ayana came to him again. This time, her movements were quicker, her pace determined. She handed him a small bundle wrapped in leather. Ethan took it, surprised by her sudden action. "There is something you must see," she said. He felt the weight of her words, the way she had said it, and for the first time, he felt the shift inside him. Something was happening here, something he had not expected. He followed her, walking side by side, as they left the camp behind. The air grew colder as they moved, the land stretching out before them, untouched and wild. As they reached the top of a hill, Ayanna stopped, her eyes scanning the horizon. Ethan followed her gaze, and there, in the distance, he saw what she had brought him to see. A herd of wild horses, their coats dark and shining under the morning sun, moving with the grace of 1,000 stories. They were free, untamed, and Ethan understood. This was what she had meant. This was what he had come for, not forgiveness, not acceptance, but a chance to be something else, something that had never been possible before. He stood there, watching the horses, the wind brushing against his skin, and for the first time, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. The silence between him and Ayanna was not empty anymore. It was full of understanding, full of the possibilities that lay ahead. And as they turned to walk back to the camp, Ethan knew that his journey had just begun. The days blurred together in the quiet rhythm of life in the Apache camp. Ethan had come to understand the quiet, the space between words that held more weight than any conversation. The camp was alive with the sounds of movement, but it was a different kind of life. There was no rush, no clock ticking away the hours. Every task had its place, every person had their role, and Ethan felt as though he was slowly finding his. It wasn't just about surviving the land anymore. It was about understanding it, about being a part of something bigger than himself. The fire at night felt less like a stranger now, the warmth of it seeping into his bones, mixing with the stories that were shared around it. But even in the comfort of the camp, something lingered. Something unspoken. He had come here to find a different life, to escape the whispers of the town that had once been his home, but it wasn't as simple as that. Ayanna had not said much more to him since the day they watched the wild horses together. She was there, always, in the background, her presence like the steady hum of the earth beneath them. Ethan had learned not to seek her out. She came to him when she needed to, and in those moments, the world felt right, as if there was no place else for him to be. One morning, as the sun barely began to touch the earth, Ayanna came to him again. This time, she carried nothing in her hands. She simply stood before him, waiting. Ethan knew what that silence meant now. He followed her without question, the same steady rhythm as before. They walked side by side, as they had before, but this time there was something different in the air, something thick with anticipation. They didn't speak as they walked. The journey was familiar, yet it felt like it was leading them somewhere unknown. As they reached the top of a hill, Ayanna stopped and pointed toward the horizon. Ethan followed her gaze, and for a moment, he saw it. There, in the distance, was the herd again, but this time, they were not just a few wild horses. This was a vision, a symbol of freedom, of everything he had come to understand in these quiet weeks. The horses were not the only thing moving. Something in him stirred, deep within his chest, as if the earth itself was calling him to something greater. Ayanna did not speak. She simply watched him, her gaze steady and unflinching, as if waiting for him to understand. Ethan took a deep breath, the air feeling heavier than before. He had come here to escape, but now he realized that this place wasn't about running away from something. It was about finding something. Finding himself. The wild horses were no longer just a symbol. They were a path, a road he had to walk, even if he didn't know where it would lead. As the horses moved, their bodies like shadows in the morning mist, Ethan stood still, a quiet understanding passing between him and Ayanna. She had shown him something he hadn't known he was looking for. The land. The people. The wildness of it all. And somewhere, beneath the surface of it all, he realized that he had already found a home. He wasn't a stranger here anymore. Not in the way he thought he was. He was a part of it, as much as the earth, the sky, and the horses that ran free in the distance. And for the first time since he had come to this place, Ethan felt something inside him settle, a quiet peace that he hadn't known was possible. He had found something he wasn't looking for, something that was more than just survival. It was life, in its truest form, and it was his to live. The days grew longer, the sun warmer, and still, Ethan found himself watching the wild horses from the hill. Each morning, he would rise before the sun, feeling the cool air against his skin, and each morning, Ayanna would be there, watching him from a distance, her presence like a shadow on the land. He knew she was waiting for something, waiting for him to understand what had been there all along. But Ethan was learning, slowly, that the land didn't ask for understanding. It simply was. And here, it was enough. Life in the camp had changed him, though not in the way he had expected. He had come here to escape, to leave behind the weight of the world he had known, but instead, he had found a different kind of world, one that wasn't shaped by expectations or promises. It was shaped by actions. By the silence between them. By the way the earth felt under his feet. One evening, as the light began to fade and the camp settled into its rhythm, Ayanna came to him again. This time, she spoke. "It is time," she said simply, her voice as steady as the mountains in the distance. Ethan didn't need to ask what she meant. He knew. They had been walking this path together, each step leading them to something unknown, but it had always been about this moment, about the choice that lay before him. He followed her as they had done so many times before, walking side by side, but this time, the air between them was different. There was no hesitation in her steps, no pause in her movements, and for the first time, Ethan felt the weight of his own hesitation. He had learned so much, but there was still a part of him that clung to what he knew, to what he had been before. They reached the edge of the camp, where the firelight flickered against the darkness, and Ayanna stopped. She turned to him, her gaze steady, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that he had never noticed before. It wasn't just the quiet strength he had come to know. It was something deeper, something that seemed to echo the land itself. "You are ready," she said, her words carrying the weight of everything they had shared, everything they had learned together. Ethan stood still, the silence between them heavy with meaning. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew that he couldn't stay where he was anymore. The land had taught him that, the same way it had taught the Apache people. It wasn't about being ready. It was about stepping forward, no matter how unsure you felt. And so, he did. He stepped forward into the night, into the unknown, with Ayanna beside him, the firelight casting their shadows long on the earth. As they walked together, the sound of their footsteps merging with the whispers of the land, Ethan felt something inside him shift. It wasn't a grand revelation. It was quieter than that. It was the understanding that he had become a part of something greater, something that wasn't about him anymore. It was about them. The camp. The land. The people who had shown him a world without words, a world where action spoke louder than anything else. And as they walked, with the dark sky above them and the fire behind them, Ethan knew that the journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The morning mist still clung to the earth as Ethan and Ayanna walked side by side, the sky above shifting from a soft purple to the golden hues of dawn. The camp was still and quiet, the only sounds being the rustling of the wind through the trees and the faint calls of birds in the distance. Ethan had never been more aware of the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that hung heavy with unanswered questions. It was the silence of understanding, of things said without words, of moments that didn't need to be filled with noise to hold meaning. The journey they were on had taken him farther than he ever imagined. When he first arrived, he had been a man with nothing but a need to escape, a need to outrun the weight of his past. But now, with each step he took beside Ayanna, he was starting to feel like he was walking towards something, not away from it. The land, the camp, the people, they were all part of something that had been here long before him, and in some quiet way, he felt like he was becoming a part of it, too. They walked in silence for hours, the rhythm of their steps matching the steady pulse of the earth beneath them. Ethan could feel the land speaking to him, not in the way people spoke, but in the way the ground underfoot felt solid and alive, like it had been waiting for him all along. The horizon stretched out before them, endless and unbroken, and Ethan realized with a quiet certainty that this was where he was meant to be. Not in the town he had left behind, not in the life he had once known, but here, on this land, with these people. Ayanna stopped at the edge of a cliff, her eyes scanning the vast landscape below. Ethan joined her, his gaze following hers, but it wasn't just the land that held his attention. It was the way she stood, the way her presence seemed to connect with everything around her, as if she and the earth were one. "What are we waiting for?" Ethan asked, his voice low, but his words filled with the same question that had been growing inside him. Ayanna turned to him, her eyes calm and steady. "The land will tell us when it's time," she said softly. Ethan nodded, not needing further explanation. He understood now that there were things beyond his control, things that couldn't be rushed or forced. He had to trust in the journey, in the path that had been laid out before him. And as he stood there, beside Ayanna, with the vast wilderness stretching out in front of him, he felt something stir within him, something deep and old, something that had been dormant for too long. It was a sense of belonging, a feeling that he had found something worth fighting for, even if that fight wasn't with a weapon, but with himself. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. And for the first time, Ethan was ready. Ready to face whatever came next, ready to learn from the land, from the people, from Ayanna. Ready to walk the path that had been waiting for him all along. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, when Ethan felt the first true weight of his decision. He had spent weeks walking the land, learning its rhythm, listening to the whispers of the earth, but now, standing on the edge of the cliff with Ayanna beside him, it felt as though the land was asking him something, demanding something. He didn't know what it was yet, but he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Ayanna remained silent, her gaze fixed on the land below. Ethan didn't ask her anything this time. He didn't need to. He knew she understood the same thing he did. There was something in the air, a shift, a moment that was more than just the passage of time. It was a turning point. He had been living here for weeks, learning, adapting, but now it was time to make a choice. It was no longer about survival. It was about what he would become. The camp behind them had grown quieter over the days, the voices of the Apache people blending with the wind. They had accepted him, not in the way a man would be accepted in a town, but in the way the earth accepts the rain or the sun. There was no ceremony. No speeches. Just the unspoken understanding that he was part of it now, as much a part of the land as anyone who had lived here their entire lives. And yet, Ethan felt something deep inside him still unsettled. He had not come here to be someone else. He had come to find himself. But in the stillness of the land, with Ayanna standing beside him, he realized that finding himself wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. The wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying the scent of the earth and the sage that grew wild in the hills. Ethan closed his eyes, taking it all in, the smells, the sounds, the feel of the land beneath his boots. When he opened his eyes again, Ayanna was looking at him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet challenge in her gaze. She had always been like this, steady, unshaken by the world around her, but in this moment, she was asking him something without saying a word. Ethan felt the weight of her gaze, the quiet pull that had been growing between them since the day he arrived. He could feel the ground beneath him, solid and alive, and for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider anymore. This was his place, too. The silence stretched between them, but it was no longer a void. It was full of everything that had led him here, full of everything that was yet to come. Finally, Ayanna spoke. "It is time," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything that had passed between them. Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. It was time to move forward. To take what he had learned and shape it into something real. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He turned toward the camp, his heart steady in his chest, and as he walked beside Ayanna, he felt the quiet certainty of the path before him. This was more than just survival. This was life, in its truest form. And he was ready to live it. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the camp as Ethan and Ayanna walked back toward the heart of it. The days had become routine in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. Ethan had found his place among the people, the land, and the silence, but something deep inside him told him that there was still more to understand. The fire had burned low in the evenings, and the air had grown cooler as the seasons began their subtle shift. Each day, the bond between him and Ayanna deepened, though it was still wrapped in the quiet understanding of shared experience. They had not spoken of the things that weighed on Ethan's mind, but the space between them had become a language all its own. She did not need to ask him questions. She could see what had not yet been said. They arrived at the camp, where the steady hum of activity greeted them. The warriors were preparing for a new hunt, their movements precise and practiced. Ethan watched them with a quiet admiration. He had seen the Apache people work, live, and breathe with an intensity he had never known, and he knew that he would never fully understand it, but he was learning. He was learning to appreciate it in a way that was more than just observation. It was becoming part of him. Ayanna motioned for him to follow her as she moved toward a group of women who were gathering around a large fire, the smoke curling up into the sky in delicate spirals. They spoke in hushed tones, their hands working quickly as they prepared the evening meal. Ethan stood at the edge of the circle, his presence barely noticeable, but Ayanna's eyes caught his. She nodded once, a small gesture that invited him in. Slowly, he stepped forward, unsure of what he was supposed to do. The women continued their work, their movements fluid, but there was an unspoken understanding that passed between them all. One of the women, older than the rest, looked at him with a knowing gaze. "You are learning," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of years lived in the rhythm of the land. Ethan nodded, his words caught in his throat. He was learning, but he wasn't sure what that meant yet. He had learned how to survive, how to adapt, but there was something more, something beyond mere survival that he had yet to grasp. The fire crackled, the flames dancing in the cool air, and for the first time, Ethan felt the full weight of the moment. He wasn't just part of the camp anymore. He was part of something larger. The women continued their work, and Ayanna moved to join them, her hands quickly finding their place among the others. Ethan remained standing at the edge, watching, absorbing. The land had taught him many things, but it was in these moments, in the quiet exchange between people, where he felt the true power of what he had been searching for. As the evening settled into night, the camp came alive with the soft murmur of voices, the crackle of the fire, and the steady rhythm of life that continued without pause. Ethan felt something stir within him, a deep, quiet understanding that he had found what he had been seeking. It wasn't a place or a title or a life that he could name. It was a part of the land, a part of the people, a part of the silence that he had learned to listen to. And for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Not in the way he had expected, not in the way he had thought he wanted, but in a way that was deeper than any thought or expectation. The land had accepted him. The people had accepted him. And now, he could finally accept himself. The seasons had begun to change, the nights growing colder as the days shortened. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the steady rhythm of the camp was now a part of Ethan, as natural to him as the beating of his own heart. He had spent months living among the Apache people, learning the ways of the land, the language of silence, and the strength that came from not needing to speak. But there was still a feeling that lingered within him, a quiet thought that he hadn't yet fully understood. It was in the stillness of the mornings, in the moments when Ayanna's eyes met his without words, when the world seemed to pause for just a breath before the next step forward. He had found peace here, in the land and among the people, but peace was not the end. It was simply another beginning. One morning, as the sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, Ethan found himself standing alone on the edge of the ridge, looking out at the vast land before him. The valley stretched out like a living thing, the trees and rivers winding through the earth like veins, pulsing with life. Ayanna appeared behind him, her presence steady and unannounced, just as it had always been. She stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the same view. "What do you see?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the silence between them. Ethan thought for a moment, unsure of how to answer. What did he see? He saw the land that had shaped him, the people who had shown him a way of life he had never known, and the stillness that had settled in his chest like a weight he had carried all his life. "I see everything," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see the land, the people, and something inside me that feels like it's been waiting for me all along." Ayanna didn't respond immediately, but her presence beside him felt like an answer in itself. She didn't need to speak. Ethan knew she understood. The land had always been waiting, and now, so had he. They stood in silence for a long while, the world around them moving without them, as it always had. The sound of the river flowing in the distance, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the soft chatter of the camp behind them, it all felt like part of something larger than them, something that was not bound by time or place, but by the very earth beneath their feet. As the morning sun began to warm the ground beneath them, Ethan felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He had come here looking for something, and now, he realized that what he had been searching for was not something outside of himself, but something within. The journey wasn't over, but he had finally understood what it meant to be a part of this land, to be a part of the people. The land had taken him in, shaped him, and now, it was his to protect, just as the Apache people had protected it for generations. Ayanna stepped back, her gaze still fixed on the horizon, and for the first time, Ethan didn't feel the need to follow her. He felt the weight of his own feet, grounded in the earth, steady and sure. The world was open before him, and for the first time, he felt like he was ready to walk it. Not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged. Someone who had found a place not just in the world, but in himself. As he turned to join Ayanna, he knew that whatever came next, he was no longer running away from his past. He was moving forward, into the future, with the land beneath his feet and the strength of those who had taught him the true meaning of belonging.